back for another encounter. Daniel Kammen is the Distinguished Professor of Energy at the University of California, Berkeley. And he took over John Holdren's chair when John Holdren went to Washington, D.C., the other Washington, to become the science advisor to President Obama. So that gives you an idea of the importance of this position. There he started and he directs the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory. And he also holds appointments at Berkeley in the Nuclear Engineering Department and the Goldman School of Public Policy. So he's a very broad person. He also served as Hillary Clinton's, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's clean energy envoy to the Americas when she was Secretary of State. And I think he's a fellow at the Secretary of at the State Department right now. And let me just close, and probably the most notable one is he wrote he was the lead author in several of the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And that group was awarded the 2007 Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, for that work along with Al Gore. So I think I've said enough, and please welcome Dan Kammen.
Thank you all so much for the chance to do this today. And before I get started, I really loved the trip up before. I have students living up here, former students living up here on Lopez Island, and for everything, Michael, you've done, I wanted to give you guys a copy of our latest book on energy and hopefully some climate solutions. So thank you all so much for doing this. So what I'd like to try to do is to build off a couple of the things that you've heard in the previous talks. And each one of these could be a full lecture in itself, but in kind of a brief form, what I'd like to do is to re-encapsulate quite quickly the climate crisis. I'm not going to, of course, do all the climate science, but I just want to give what I would regard as a kind of a 3-minute sort of overview on why I think it's so incredibly serious and why the kind of solution space is so vital. And so I'll go from there talking about the issues on both energy from the standpoint of industrialized countries. So the problem of moving clean energy from the sidelines where it was to the main part of the story, but also about energy access and the inequality or inequity. And I'm going to really try to go back and forth between the challenges that we face in so-called industrialized settings and those in developing countries, because in many ways they're actually very similar. Some of the most exciting innovations that I see are actually not coming from the US, Europe, Japan, and Korea. They're coming from very poor industrializing, rapidly changing energy economies, and we have some experts in the room who will join on the panel in a bit, who are working directly on this space of off-grid and mini-grid energy systems. And while I know it's ambitious to have 4 things in a 45-minute talk, the goal is to really try to pull these together at the end and looking at where I think this solution space is going. And for any of the material I don't cover, we normally say that everything I don't cover on the course will be well covered on the final exam. And so in this case, I'll just put up the website of my laboratory, but what I find more useful to people is the Twitter feed, because what we try to post is about 1 tweet a day or 1 tweet every 2 days, kind of highlight new, interesting innovations. And so you had Naomi Oreskes speak here, and she and I were partners in a dialogue that the Vatican called about a year before the encyclical came out. And so we were designed to be the team that I would, in theory, speak towards the sciences of climate solutions, because I'm a physicist, and Naomi, as a historian, would talk about merchants of doubt and the wider, not just political, but also the social context in which decisions get made or don't get made. And so she and I have a nice partnership over a couple years on this. And again, anyone who wants to go to that Twitter feed, we try to post things pretty regularly, but never overwhelming. So kind of 1 a day is our apple a day kind of level. So again, I'm not going to try to encapsulate the whole climate story. I really just want to give a super quick overview. Everyone who does talks like this, myself included as part of the IPCC, and just to note, this Nobel Prize sharing. So Al Gore gets half of the prize, and the IPCC, about 2,000 of us, get the other half, and so I guess we're all micro-Gores, would be kind of the unit of comparison there, although that doesn't sound really good. But almost all talks like this highlight some version of the following picture. And it's designed to be kind of a little bit impenetrable, important, oh, we should revere this graph. And what it sort of highlights is that the temperature record, this is degrees C, and my energy supply, my pointer already died. But this red path, the business as usual path that would get us to 4 to 6 degrees of climate change, is the path that we are certainly were on, and arguably are still on, except as we get into the solutions part of today, there's a whole bunch of really exciting things taking place that I think are changing that story pretty rapidly. And so I'll highlight those. And again, without doing each of the detailed individual pieces, what you have over here in this kind of set of thermometers is the 2 degrees C, or I've marked 1.5 degrees on here because that's where I would personally like us to go, is to limit warming to 1.5 degrees or so. Thank you so much for doing that. Sorry that mine failed and demonstrated a lack of power from Berkeley. Much better. And so the idea that we could cut off this growth path and instead follow this blue line and more or less save this big triangle or this wedge of energy that we don't need, carbon we don't need to emit, and I will argue money that we could be saving. And technically and arguably economically, we have enough options to make that happen. But the real challenge is if we don't hit this kind of barrier, the worry is that a whole set of studies have indicated the really dramatic problems and changes that our ecosystems will face. You've talked about in the previous talks. And while there's no simple way to encapsulate all the features, the climate is a complex system. We don't understand all of it, so there's always reason not to be a merchant of doubt, but to be kind of a thoughtful skeptic. And so there's lots and lots of room where someone who wants to be the contrarian can say, oh, I don't believe that this particular cold warm winter or this particular event is related to climate change. To kind of cut that off, there's a fabulously useful pure data, so no modeling, no analysis like I'll show later on, but there's a wonderful data set that NASA posts and updates every couple of years, earthobservatory.nasa.gov. If you just go to that site and search for movie or sea ice, you will get this video. And what you're going to see is satellite images compiled by NASA from 1979 to today, taken at the time in late summer, early fall, when the Arctic sea ice is at its minimum. And so the exact date, the data point for each date varies, but it's the time when you look back retrospectively after the summer is over, you see when the ice was at its minimum. And for any of you who've seen movies like Chasing Ice, you know it's not just the extent of ice. It's also that as you shrink the ice caps or pieces, whether it's on land or on the ocean, you also get a compactification. And so you're talking about a dramatic loss in volume, which is even more severe than what you're going to see in terms of the extent of the loss. And so let me just show you that video, partially because while many of you talk about these topics, it's a great way to highlight what's going on. It's 22 seconds long, so there's almost no talk format in which you can't fit it into the story. So let me just play it, because again, as a place to get a really concise picture of what's happening, this is in million square kilometers of ice, going back again to the 1970s. And so, you know, these pictures have the clouds rendered out, so we're just seeing the extent of ice over the North Pole. There are some colder years, warmer years. There's noise in the system, which is why scientists are actually their worst enemy often in terms of telling you definitively this or that event is due to climate change. We deal much more with probabilities than what the news media likes to hear. Hurricane Sandy was 57.2% worse because of climate change. We can't say that kind of thing. But when you look at this graph with now decades of history, we have a 50% drop in sea ice over this period of time. And that's just remarkable. I mean, the up and down years. So I guess this is a Bjorn Lomborg year. This is a Steve Schneider year. But we get, you know, kind of people telling the story. But this is such an unambiguous signal. And we're only beginning to understand the extent of the impacts of this. And so I regard this as, again, just a really powerful record that gives you a very clear place to go if you want in a talk that you might give to really highlight how clear the climate change story is. And it's no modeling, no, you know, this is not synthesized data. There's none of the things that climate deniers love to point to. And again, it's a great site to think about these things. That said, climate isn't, of course, the only one of our problems. This is a picture from an absolutely brilliant New York Times series, which I think will win this coming year's Pulitzer Prize. But this is a Southern California development highlighting the degree to which we can ignore every possible signal about land use and water and all manner of things. And obviously these guys, I guess, they're early adopters in terms of waste and this landscape, just not so far east from Los Angeles. And it really highlights that energy is not the only feature. Water, critical crisis. We have droughts and various serious features going on. And so thinking about the system, and so I fear that my conclusion from this talk is going to be very not 1960s. It's going to be the system is the solution. And it's really integration, it's not the system is the enemy. And so in the places where we don't think more holistically about energy, water, biodiversity, cultural issues, you guarantee we're going to cause some serious problems in terms of getting to a solution if we're only focused on energy or water or something else. So that story is what I want to highlight. And again, these iconic climate records showing the global average surface temperature, the sea level rise for which we're committed now to a significant amount over the decades, and while we have a shorter record, the record of the decrease in the northern hemisphere snow cover, all of these science records from a kind of a physics, chemistry perspective, I would say have been pretty clear that if we had this data go look backwards, from at least the 1980s forward, we've had a very clear sign. Now, admittedly, if you're sitting right here, and there's a year like that, and it comes back down, you can see why this community didn't rush into action as many of us think we should have. But if we see where we are now, we're in a very clear trend where we're seeing very large global trends. But the strongest statement that the international climate community, the IPCC, has been able to make, consultation with all governments and people from all countries. Back in 1990, when the first assessment report came out, it was unequivocal detection of human impact not likely for a decade. And you can sort of hear the legalistic rambling, getting the words just right to kind of say that statement. Second assessment, I was in the room when discernible took 8 hours. Right? Balance of evidence suggests discernible human, it's just tortured statement. Right? But, we've got to get something out, and that was as far as we could get. A friend of mine says something or get off the pot, but we'll leave that because it's on the audience. Third assessment, most of the warming in the last 50 years is likely. First-time probabilities appeared in the statement. The fourth assessment report in 2007, most of the warming is very likely due to human activity. And then the first really normative statement, and the reason why I'm going to kind of split this talk between looking at on-grid, industrialized economies, and the poor, not just the poor in Laos or Nicaragua or Kenya, but the poor globally, to say warming will most strongly and quickly impact the global poor. And because whether the poor vote or not, in the same way that rich people do, we know they're not listened to anywhere near as much. And so we have a huge environmental justice and equity issue built into the problems here. The most recent report, the fifth assessment report, AR5, right at the present time says 95% confidence warming is caused by humans. So that still leaves us a little bit of wiggle room. There's no wiggle room in the scientific dialogue. There is wiggle room in the politics of getting 189 nations to agree with the statement. But it tells you where we are. And while I'm going to talk about the things that haven't happened, what has happened is not enough, but it's remarkable. In the sense that that business as usual red curve I showed you before said we were on a pathway to 4 to 6 degrees of warming, which would be an absolute calamity in incredible numbers of different ways. And as tragic as that is, and knowing that 2 degrees or less is where we need to go, we are not doing bad for a global community that is totally disorganized on this. And that sounds like a big statement, but that's the path I showed you before. This is where we need to go. But already the commitments made by the countries that will be negotiating in Paris in December are about 3 to 3.5 degrees. The updated version of this number has a number about 3.1. But this is not complete, but it should at least give you signs of hope. I'll mention what the US and China have done, developing countries. It is by far the easier part of the story, basically becoming more efficient and installing clean energy where it already beat out fossil energy. But it's a far cry from where we were just a little bit ago. And thinking about what we need to do here is going to be a challenge. but this already should give people what I have, which is a real optimism that we're likely to be able to get this done. That doesn't mean we're not passing on some really messed up ecosystems to our children, and one of mine is here so that she can sue me later on because we are guilty. But there's a really interesting set of things evolving in this solution space. And when you look at the kind of iconic pictures of the Earth, kind of a picture, a synthetic picture at night with just massive amount of energy access in most industrialized economies, this also highlights the fact that many people are living without access to energy and access to electricity. And in fact, it's absolutely critical. If we add up the numbers, today there's about 1.4 billion people living without access to electricity. And the forecast is that in 2030, things won't have changed. About 1.2 billion people are currently forecast by the US and international energy agencies to still be without power in 2030. So that's some added electrification and services, but more people being born. And these pie charts show the mixture of rural and urban today on the left, and in 2030, the forecast on the right. And you can see that while things aren't awful in Latin America, they're actually not that great in parts of Central America, but in Sub-Saharan Africa, India, and South Asia, we have a forecast for this continuing lack of energy. If I kind of sum these numbers up, this is looking at people on the planet going back to 1830, total population, and there's been a persistent 1.3 to 2 billion people without access to electricity since we started building electrical systems. And so the question is, if we take the difference of these lines, that's this line here, people without access, what systems are we going to use to provide them energy while thinking about this envelope of dramatic decarbonization? Basically reducing our carbon emissions from the energy sector by 80% or more in the next 34.5 years. So it is a tight run, and different groups have different assessments. If we think about traditional grids expanding, as is going on today, that's this little pink part of that solution space. Mini grids that I'll talk about, we have some experts here, can play some role. And then direct at the household energy access, off-grid poor communities is another piece. And these percentages are not designed to signify anything. It's just, I'm just thinking about where we might get going down the line. And so I want to spend a few minutes highlighting why it's so critical to be thinking about energy access as we also think about decarbonizing the system. So here are a series of graphs put together. This shows electricity consumption per person. And the numbers aren't critical, so this goes from 0 up to 16,000 kilowatt hours a year. Most US citizens are between about 7,500 and 12,000 kilowatt hours a year. There's a few both super energy visors. I had a grad student a number of years ago who was in school with Graecen, and his email address was 9watts@gmail.com until they had a baby, and then there were 12 watts@gmail.com. And so what you see here is energy use around the world. Each dot is a country, and so this is a correlation, not a causation. But what you see is that for literacy levels, mortality, poverty, access to sanitation, there's this really interesting behavior where, again, this is just showing the data, not implying there's a path, but there's a need in each one of these curves. And as we get more and more energy access at the low level, services grow. And then there's a long period afterwards where, while the service level is pretty similar, the mortality rate is pretty similar as you go from, say, 4,000 kilowatt hours all the way up to 16. Similar stories for sanitation and other things. After that, infrastructure, policy, and choices really dominate. But growing energy access in that first little bit really transforms lives. So one way to think about it here, I've replotted this, where I've done the percentage of people in each country that have energy access from 0 to 100%. Each dot is a country. And if you look at things like the Human Development Index, which is not just GDP per person, a bit of a crude measure. Human Development Index is actually 1/3 GDP per person, 1/3 educational attainment, and 1/3 expected life expectancy to kind of balance out, not just all make it about the market economy. And each dot's a country, and so we see the Human Development Index really ramps up pretty steadily across a wide range. But you see, as energy access goes up for people, dramatic change, gender parity in education, the number of kids in grade 1 who complete primary education, all of these, different slopes, a lot of scatter, but show this really clear connection and correlation with more and more energy access. And so there's a really fundamental story about economic opportunity for individuals, for countries, for regions, cities, by making energy access available. And again, the overall goal I want to highlight today is that I believe we have the tools, both technical and policy, to think about 0 people without access by 2030, dramatic cuts in our carbon emissions, and I'll try to spend the next half hour kind of highlighting a number of those features and where they fit together. So when I started school, I had a wonderful professor get a Nobel Prize actually for work in electrodynamics, looking at the life cycle of stars, and he thought that if solar power on the grid was more than a fraction of a percent, grids would become unstable, there would be disasters, the world would kind of end, and we now have communities that are a third, 50%, 60% solar in small communities, and there are plans around the world for dramatic changes. Solar has also started off as very expensive technology, so I'll show you, I'm not going to do it for each technology, but I'll use solar as an example of something which has gone through the so-called learning curve transition. And so what I'm going to plot next is the evolution of solar, but the units are going to be a little different than some of you might have seen. So first of all, for the engineers, this is a log-log plot. For everyone else, this just means this is decades. This is the Richter scale kind of plots. Cost of electricity on this axis, but the horizontal axis is not time. Time is just a date stamp along this curve. What's plotted here instead is total global production of the technology. And what you see here is this, there's lots of bumps and wiggles, there's different technological innovations that contribute to this process, but in this log-log space, the slope of this line tells you how quickly the technology is innovating. And what we see around the world for technologies that can be mass-produced occur just like this. Laptop computers, big pens, condoms, anything you can mass-produce comes out, and what we get is very close to a picture like this. Every time you double the number of widgets that are built, and hopefully sold, but those are manufactured, we get the slope of this line, and that's a 20% price reduction. And there are some technologies that don't follow it. They're interesting exceptions. I'll come to those in a little bit. But what this says is that as we thought about solar that was so high priced when I began teaching at Berkeley, I have a very large energy and society class that I teach. It's got about 300 students in it. When I started teaching this class 15 years ago, when it had 30 students in it, I had talked about how great solar was, but it was so far from being economic. It was going to be early adopters, leading-edge communities, utilities like Opelco, places that had both a local connection and a desire to push well beyond the mainstream. Now, as I'll highlight, we are down here in a space where solar is now cost competitive. 30 years evolution, dramatic change. We are getting a 10% decrease in cost in solar each year. In the United States, at utility scale, wind is the cheapest new technology to install, meaning you pick the right location, under 3 cents per kilowatt hour for wind power. And there are places where unsubsidized, there are solar projects under 5 cents per kilowatt hour. And that is so shockingly different than utility executives around the world believe that even if you show them numbers coming from the US government, etc., there are still people who simply don't believe it. They say, oh no, solar is 50 cents a kilowatt hour. No chance, it's 5 cents. And in fact, there are places where it's that today. And that shift in mindset is, again, really, I go to federal meetings with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and very well-educated executives at energy companies, utilities, just simply don't believe the numbers. But it's true. So here is a plot of, in the OECD nations, renewable energy generation going back to the 70s. Overall, it's been growing anemically at first and then more rapidly. And many people said, oh yeah, if renewable energy is growing, it must be hydropower. But in fact, I pulled them out here. So this green is solar, wind, geothermal, and biomass. And this is the hydropower curve. So we are getting kind of remarkable change in the field. Is it fast enough to wait for market forces to bring us renewables, phase out fossil fuel? Absolutely not. Not just because of the cost number, but for the reasons I said in the beginning. And that is, the system is the solution. And so while solar or wind prices may have dropped dramatically, we have examples of places where a solar farm or a wind farm was installed, but the utility or the developer didn't have the money or chose not to hook it up to the grid. And so you can have the resources low cost and yet it's not connected. In fact, the utility I won't mention, Southern California Edison, contracted for a wind farm, contracted for the grid to be sent to that to that farm, discovered that the provider of the grid financing wasn't reliable. The solar farm was installed, and they chose to simply pay off the developers. They paid the renewable energy developers the entire contract they owed them, 8 years of money. Never hooked them up to the grid, because that was the harder contract to put together, and they decided it was worth their while not to bother with the grid connections. Well, it turns out now, 20 years later, they've gone back and the utility built that grid line out. Of course, that renewable facility was long since discarded. They're building a new one. So it's not just the cost of the hardware, but it highlights that things can be done. And to highlight a project which is absolutely fun to work on, and something I took on initially not because I thought it was a research project, because who could pass up the chance to build a renewable system on Marlon Brando's island? So this is Tetiaroa, the Motu, about a 25-minute boat ride off of Papeete in French Polynesia, and this was the Motu that was deeded long-term to the Brando family after he made Mutiny on the Bounty. So a friend called us up and said, would we help design the renewable energy system for this island, where they wanted to build a series of beach getaways and a research center to look at, like you have here, ocean acidification, changes in biodiversity, etc. So there was a somewhat dilapidated, nowhere near as grand as the drawing here, runway for Marlon Brando's son to get on and off the island. And so we began to design the system. And again, a project that I took on really because it just seemed too cool, taught us a huge amount. 2 years after the beginning of the design process, the project is complete. So they have a research center, they have guest bungalows, they have a series of projects where they're looking at what's happening as the near shore waters warm. And so what went into making this 100% renewable was first to put a 0.5 megawatt solar array along the side of the runway. Half of it is typical ground mounted like this, and part of it over here is a piece which is solar panels that are the taxiway. And so they multi-used the space. They've been running for 2 years now. They have not had crackage or anything, and things have worked fine. Also, they just started a process to collect coconut husks and make a biofuel facility. They're now collecting biofuel from neighboring islands as well, so that they have that as a backup generator system. They've added a SWAC system, a saltwater air conditioning. Because the water gets so deep so fast, you only need to go out go out a couple hundred yards and then down about 1 kilometer, and you get 5 degrees C ocean water, and you bring that up with a heat exchanger. All of the air conditioning on this very humid place is now run with this SWAC system. There's another one in Hawaii, there's another one in Bora Bora, but when you have the cold water, it's a wonderful, very passive system to use. Because they wanted long-term reliability, they installed a zinc bromide flow battery from a company up in Vancouver, which has also installed them at Whistler and other places. And then the last piece of the story is a place where I'm really glad I did this, not just because it's great to go there, my wife and daughters got to go along, but because we learned something really unusual and different about the system, at least in my view. And that is a company in Perth, Australia, makes a system which is a tank of fresh water. The density difference gives you an item that bobs back and forth differently than just a current, so it harvests energy from the current, the wave motion, and runs not only an extra generator, but we use the low pressure end, something called the bottoming cycle for the engineers, to run a reverse osmosis system. So we get fresh water effectively for free in this integrated system. And again, I highlight this for reasons I mentioned before. It really shows you what you learn about pulling things together. So it's a really interesting integrated system that working fine, and again, a couple years, commercial developer went fast. So that sounds great, but not so fast. We have to think about a whole variety of parts of the system. And again, this is where I want to go back and forth between different technologies and how they link together. So in California and here in San Juan's, transportation is the largest piece of our carbon footprint. And so as green as we need to get, I mean, absolutely every building that doesn't install solar or a heat pump or become massively efficient is really not doing what we think economically makes sense. But we need to think much more about how do we make clean vehicles part and parcel of that story. And so I see at least a couple electric vehicle owners in the room here. How many EV owners? Pretty good turnout. I suspect there might be a slight selection bias to go to this as opposed to watching football. But and I think some on the order of about 100, 110 EVs in the islands?
Yeah, it includes plugins.
Okay, so if you include plugins, about 110 so far. I would argue for this type of community, that means that we haven't gotten the word out anywhere near as much as we should get, but there are some reasons why. And so part of it is that there was range anxiety, there was worry about the prices, but the wide variety of electric vehicles available today is really transformative. And another feature that doesn't come up all the time in conversation is that if you want to drag race your house and drag race your car, the car will win, right? You turn everything onto your house, and it doesn't go anywhere, right? At least, except for California where they go. Anyway, but you turn your car on and it goes somewhere. In fact, many years ago, Alan Alda and I held a race at the Infineon Speedway in Northern California, and the race was, we will take on in our electric vehicle. It was the T0, it was kind of a forerunner of the Tesla. And so we said we will take on any combustion vehicle in a race and we guarantee we will win. And we ran, I think, 20 races. We won every one. The footnote was, it's a drag race. So it was a quarter-mile drag race. We won against Lamborghinis, we won against all kinds of things, because electric vehicles give you that real pickup. And anyone who's seen the Tesla in its zip mode with the people, like, you know that you could, they can be sexy too. But the feature is that the economics have changed so much that if you compare your house to your car uses several times the power if you turned on everything in your home. So in some sense, if we want to make this switch to electric vehicles to take advantage of a variety of things I'll mention in a second, every time you get a new electric vehicle, it's like several homes. And so utilities that are worried about losing solar customers or losing customers to solar and not having the money to pay for upgrades and retrofits and undersea cables and all kinds of things that they're going to need, every time you add an electric vehicle, it's equivalent to adding a couple of other consumers. And so this interesting trade-off, and I've seen many utility CEOs from places I won't mention, Arizona, California, Georgia, and in those places they say the last thing I want ever is to see an electric vehicle. And I say, so if I was a startup company and I came in and said I want to install EVs, and you would say, no, please don't triple my business, right? Because that's what a utility is saying. If you don't install an EV, you're saying I really don't want to sell you 3 times more power. It's a crazy business decision that a lot of utilities, just because they're not experienced, are not pushing out for. But people, individuals, should be pushing hard, because here is the story in terms of energy. If we go back to the 1990s, this is the price of electricity, and what I've done here, just to keep it simple, is I take in the average price of electricity across the whole country, weighted by the number of people. So this is the average price based on number of people in a state, times that cost of power. So you go back to the 1990s, come to the present time, the average cost of power across the country is, again, about 12 cents. It was 12, it dipped a bit, it's going back up. Again, why, as many of you know, is much higher in the 20s. And there's some cheap power out here, largely hydro-based. But if that's the price of electricity, this is the price of gasoline going back to that time. I'm going to combine this. I'm going to say, let's say you power your car with solar on your roof, or you buy your power elsewhere. And so this was the price of basically powering your home and buying gasoline going back to the 1990s up to the present time. And if you installed solar and had an electric vehicle, this is what you get. And you see sometime in about 2011 or so, the prices crossed. meaning that having an electric vehicle and having solar on your rooftop to run your home system, that's now cheaper than buying power on average from the grid and running your car on gasoline. And obviously what you're also saying here is that I choose to move my purchases of petroleum to my utility, my municipal utility, my investor-owned utility, my cooperative, whatever it might be. This transition has incredible, interesting ramifications. First of all, it's much easier to decarbonize our electricity system than think about options to get carbon out of our liquid fuels. There are a couple options, I'll mention them briefly in a second, but it's hard to do. Electricity, we have lots and lots of means and modes to decarbonize our electricity mix, and this crossover between clean energy, whether it's on your rooftop or a utility scale project run by your cooperative, your municipal, or your investor-owned utility, means that you can now power up the vehicles and give more business to those people who are providing that clean energy as opposed to liquid fossil fuels. So this transition is a story that, again, even though it's been known for several years in the techie, nerdy world, it is certainly not broad enough part of the story. Now, there are some places that have invested in this for quite a while, and while I won't dwell on the slides, I just want to give you kind of the California picture, because we make an interesting series of mistakes in California, but also a series of things that have worked well. And in fact, one of the leading lights in energy back in the 1970s, before PowerPoint, where he sent his data to a draftsman to be drawn up, Art Rosenfeld, considered the father of energy, or now the grandfather of energy efficiency, looked at what our energy use would be like if we just kept building business as usual versus if we conserved. And again, you see one of these wedges or triangles of conservation. Nuclear plants not built, fossil fuel plants not built, hydro and other facilities we don't need. In fact, at one point, California's plan was for a nuclear power plant every 20 miles along the coast. Today we have one. There's a lot of reasons for that. Same thing for fossil fuel. The plans were for over 250 fossil fuel plants in California if we followed that business as usual path. In fact, California by 2020 will have phased out all imported coal, and there is no coal burned in the state anymore. So again, one of these versions of the change around efficiency. In fact, here is across the whole United States, going back to 1960, kilowatt hours per person consumed in California and the US were pretty similar. But after the OPEC crisis, while the rate of growth in electricity slowed in the US, right, this line compared to one like that, California, through a whole series of measures, has kept electricity use per capita flat since then. Now we have a lot more capitas, so energy use has gone up, but it's a remarkable change, and while it's faint on here, Denmark is even more efficient because they actually use the waste heat from power plants to also heat municipal areas. So 2006, California passed its climate law, and it said instead of simply the black as actual historic data at that time, the gray was the forecast. What California said is we need to get back to our 1990 baseline level in 2020. And there were lots of arguments this would bankrupt the economy, there'd be no jobs, whatever else. California's energy economy has grown faster than the economy of the state overall, has generated more jobs than was the utility forecast, and California is ahead of schedule to get back to that point. And so through a whole series of visions about being more efficient, kind of shrinking the box of our, moving the box of our emissions, crushing it down by using less liquid fuel and by using less electricity, shifting away from liquid fuels, as I've said, towards more electricity, because we can clean that much more reasonably, and then always picking the cleaner fuels, so crushing this box down, where the greenhouse gas intensity of fuels, we choose gas over coal, we choose renewables over gas. In fact, the worry right now is that gas systems leak, and at the current leakage rates, we observe gas facilities around the world where their leakage rate is above about 2.5% or 3% per year. And in that case, a coal-fired power plant is better on a greenhouse gas base than a gas plant. Not necessarily better on a slag and water and other features, but if you don't make it a tight, non-leaky system, gas can be part of the problem, not part of the solution. And ultimately, gas is part of the problem too, because we're going to need to cut out 80% of our emissions. So that story, kind of quickly told, highlights where California is, and while this guy, I was skeptical when he came into office, he started a remarkable process, and now Governor Brown, our recycled governor, has pushed even further. So now we have the world's largest solar thermal plant in the desert. We have the world's largest solar thin film facility, world's largest wind farm. The most solar in the country, California, just crossed 490,000 homes with solar on the roof. Our goal in 2020 is 1 million. And things like Tesla and others building electric vehicles, something we never thought vehicle manufacturing would be coming back to California, but in fact it is all part and parcel of this process. We also have rules like every new home after 2020 has to generate as much energy as it uses. So you've got to be really energy efficient and install solar or other things. It doesn't say solar, it says make it a net energy producer. And well, the construction industry, even though they know this, they haven't really started to fight it yet. I'm betting about 2018 they will say it can't be done. But we're already working on legislation that would say if your home is in a place that's not conducive for sun, your resource, whether it's a wind farm you buy a share in or whether it's a rooftop solar somewhere, doesn't have to be contiguous. You could build a home in cloudy Pacifica, California, but your piece of a solar roof could be on an IKEA in Los Angeles. So the idea that you would have part of your property value tied to clean energy facilities is one way to kind of deal with these issues that are coming. This one we can do today. This one we cannot. We do not know how to make office buildings with all their floors net energy neutral by 2030, but in its, I think, wisdom, or some people say foolishness, California passed this rule at the same time it passed this one. So not a stretch, stretch. So this story about vehicles really highlights a whole bunch of features, and this is a graph that only a true energy nerd would love. What it shows is the series of things California plans to do between today and 2050 to get that 80% reduction. And it's things like that 1 million solar rooftops, also 1 million electric vehicles. I mentioned we've just crossed, we're crossing the 500,000 point right now for solar rooftops, and we have about 150,000 electric vehicles in the state. Started later, but ramping up, and again, this synergy between electric vehicles and solar is just a natural thing to think about. We just passed a law that by 2030, California has to be 50% powered by renewables, and for us, renewable is solar, wind, biomass, and small hydro. It does not include large hydro, it does not include nuclear, but it highlights tying all of these kinds of things together. And while we've spoken mainly about developed economies, Kenya, not a place you would normally think of as a clean energy leader, actually has a very similar mission. The Prime Minister has passed a goal for that 80% decarbonization by 2050. They're right now going through a program to complete the construction of Africa's largest wind farm, 330 megawatts. They have the largest off-grid lighting program that I'll show a few pictures on in a bit. And the big cornerstone piece of the Kenya program is actually to replace their 60% dependency on hydropower today and drop that to less than 30% while building a whole series of geothermal facilities along the Rift Valley and moving industrial producers to those spots as we go. And so again, you get all these kinds of features. Here's a picture of some of the geothermal wells. That's a 10 megawatt facility going in Kenya. But again, only 20% of Kenyans are on grid. Off-grid facility, this is a shop in rural Kenya showing many of the devices of a whole diversity of companies that started out looking like glorified flashlights. Whole bunch of devices. We just had a conversation earlier about this company right here with a friend. But these are high-efficiency LED lights, batteries that have gone through the same learning curve that the solar is, largely because of laptops and cell phones, and then these now much lower-cost solar cells. And so there's this huge diversity of products. Kenya is one of the few countries that has incredibly reliable e-banking. So there's a program in Kenya called M-Pesa, and you do all your banking over your cell phone. You pay for all kinds of things. You can actually go to the hairdresser and pay directly on your smartphone. But one feature of that is so-called pay-as-you-go solar. So you take the device home for often zero down payment, and you pay it back with electronic payments you make over time. And I've just plotted the countries that have become leaders. And right now, Peru, parts of East Africa, and India are really the leaders in getting different pay-as-you-go providers. In each case, you need the energy system, and you also need this kind of reliable mobile banking. And it's not just these kind of nice glorified flashlights. It's everything from AC or DC low-power refrigerators, low-power televisions, a whole variety of things being pulled together that give you this overall picture of all these technologies pulled together. Now, there is another 800 or 8,000 pound gorilla in the room I want to highlight, but instead of the process that we've seen so far, and the reason why I'll conclude with highlighting why I'm so optimistic for this Paris conference coming up, is because instead of the 180 nation negotiation that each of these treaties has been based around the past, the Kyoto Protocol, treaties that require everyone to get together, last year President Obama and Premier Xi decided just to step outside the process and to basically say, we're the big dogs, we're the biggest energy consumers, we're the biggest polluters, we are going to move on an agreement on our own. And that agreement was for the US to cut their emissions from their baseline level by about 20% by 2030, and for China to do something that sounds more modest, but is really not, and that is to peak their emissions in 2030 and then come down. This agreement, this G2, if you will, is a step outside the system. And so, while many people were excited about the Copenhagen conference 4 years ago, this one, and that one ended up in failure, this one I think can't anymore. We've already seen big dogs feeding first in this case, really setting up their agreements. We've seen all of this off-grid energy come online, and while the battles over the details are going to keep people really busy, and we still could mess this up, the opportunity to make this into a massive success is now in front of us in ways it wasn't before. So thank you so much for the time, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Dan, and you've been 45 minutes on the spot. So let me begin this in conversation with Bays by noting that there's a new book out, and it's in the library. I have the library copy, called Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk in a Digital Age by MIT sociologist and psychologist Sherry Turkle, and I highly recommend it. We're working on her to bring her here, but it's still a long shot. Right? Highly recommended, The Power of Talk in the Digital Age. Before I go on, I forgot to mention our sponsors. The Coates Vineyards, who has been with us from the very beginning, and the San Juan Island Conservation District, in cooperation with Opalco, are providing most of the funding for this event this evening. Now, as I said before, we have our own energy experts that we'd like to respond to this talk. Many of you, if not most of you, know Bill Anders from Orcas Island, now moving to Anacortes. But you probably don't know that he was the first chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission when it began in 1976. And also was an engineer working on nuclear power systems at General Electric. So Bill, if you can come up and take one of these seats. Graecen of Lopez Island was a graduate student under Dan Kammen. And he's been a consultant and active in renewable energy systems for the developing world. Probably a lot more, but I don't know it. Chris Graecen. Eric Youngren, who has his own solar company, Solar Nexus International, and they're getting into micropower systems where a village scale unit, can have all of the pieces and parts from the photovoltaics to the network, the inverters that it needs to have such systems in the developing world. So let me give the phone
Well, Dan, it's pretty clear that you're a university professor because 45 minutes, I believe, I have two kids who graduated with PhDs from Berkeley. And and I think the bell rang every 45 minutes. And that,
The bell was right here.
yeah. Well, you commented, you griped about not getting part of the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, you know, I've got a claim there too. Do you remember how the movie started?
The movie?
Yeah, the Inconvenient Truth.
I don't.
You start out with a picture of Earthrise.
Very nice.
Absolutely no credit. I think Al Gore thought he took it right after he invented the internet. If I just had 1 mil from every picture. But anyway, I can't resist suggesting that had it been almost anybody, seriously now, than Al Gore, who introduced climate change, you probably wouldn't have the far right so much against it. I really think that's a part of the reason. And maybe if Donald Trump really announced it, then the left would be against climate change. I started out earlier than Mike suggested. When I went to graduate school of the Air Force, wanting to be a test pilot, I suddenly found myself in nuclear engineering. Unbeknownst to me at the time, the Air Force had the view that Bill Anders and a few others would be the test pilot of the nuclear-powered airplane. It's a molten salt core, and thank God that was canceled. Can you imagine a nuclear-powered airplane flying around? And as chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, I would have sure hated to have to license that guy. I was with General Electric, and the designs of the Fukushima 1, 2, and 3 power plants, well, I guess all of them basically were basic General Electric boiling water design. Little, you know, they've all been included as a disaster, but the plants actually worked exactly as they were regulated. The little minor detail that the Japanese didn't provide, which they built the plants and sited them, was they didn't provide power to run the various backup systems should the core shut down, and which they did. And I think 3 of the Fukushima 1, 2, and 3's power plants were sited down in what had been a floodplain many times before. They were taken out, but worse yet, the switching for the backup generators for Fukushima 3, 4, and 5, the switching was below water level. So though they had the generators working after the tsunami, they couldn't turn on little valves and switches to get the built-in systems of, I guess they were Gen 2 nuclear power plants. They couldn't get them to work. And so you have to wonder whether it's nuclear power or siting that's the real bugaboo here. Now, one thing, and I don't know this about Japan, but I do know that in the United States, I started out actually as a commissioner of the Atomic Energy Commission. And the Atomic Energy Commission at the time, the early 70s, was in charge not only of regulation, but development. So we were our own team and our own refs. And somebody with brains in the Nixon administration, though that was a limited supply back in those days, somebody had the idea that this was definitely a conflict of interest. So while I was in the Atomic Energy Commission, they switched to separating the two. And to my surprise, mainly because I guess I wasn't a lawyer, the Nixon administration in their perverse ways made me the chair. I don't think, certainly in Japan, as I've seen it from afar, and I'm basically retired, but I don't think you had the rigor and separation of regulation. And there was TEPCO, who ran the plant, and some of the government people were pretty friendly in the good old boy system. And you don't have that in the United States. It's a very adversarial, if I may, relationship between the nuclear siter, designer, utility, and the and the judges. So I think in this country it's a much safer situation, and we really basically had no real problems in this country. You could have stood downwind from 3 Mile Island and breathed heavily for the whole deal. It would be like about 6 flights to Denver on a jet. So different scale of activity. Now, and you didn't say anything about nuclear really, but my hope as an old guy is my grandchildren will be enjoying electrons not only from solar and wind, but from what they call Generation 4 nuclear power plants, which are designed, or at least the design criteria, which is easy to say, but probably pretty hard to get, of sustainability, safety, low cost, and most importantly, the inability to divert plutonium, which is the bugaboo of nuclear power. Nuclear power started, you know, with the big mushroom cloud, which is not really true, but that's the image. It's been aided and abetted by Chernobyl and now Fukushima. But it's the plutonium that's used in nuclear weapons that one must be very careful not to get diverted, because it's pretty easy to make a bomb. I could make one out of plutonium or highly enriched uranium. I don't know that it would take out E-sound for sure. I'm not sure what else, but it'd make a big mess. But it's the plutonium people worry about. I've had a hardball-sized piece of plutonium in my hand. Ralph Nader says, you know, even one atom will kill you. Fact of the matter is, any of us who are old enough to be alive during above-ground testing, I think, have 10 to the 11th nuclear atoms in our lungs. So for you old folks, you check each other out, husband and wife, at night and see if you glow in the dark. But until we get, I mean, the price of shale oil and whatnot is making it very tough for all competitive sources. And I guess that's good, because we don't want to be held hostage by these robbers over in Southwest Asia. I won't mention any names, just like you didn't, but Saudi Arabia comes to mind. That until we can get, get solar, wind, and I think efficient and safe nuclear, the world's going to be in trouble.
Okay, so I just continue.
Yeah, I'll respond back.
Okay,
When they're all.
great. So the first thing that comes to mind was a saying about nuclear that I've heard. It's a perfect technology if humans were infallible. And, got one infallible human. Okay, right, and with the Pope, so one of the things I just thought I'd bring to the stage was an acknowledgement of Dan's help with writing sections of the Pope's encyclical and being part of that committee. And with that, one of the key messages of the Pope's encyclical was that climate change is really a moral issue. And I just, that's really important, and I love the way that shifts the conversation.
You say something about my birth before. That's the real
I don't think the Pope is going to touch that. Dan was mentioning that transportation is a big contributor to carbon dioxide. And this morning, by coincidence, I was doing some calculations on some information I could find on the net that really confirms that for San Juan County. I thought it was kind of interesting to bring it home. And so I looked at, well, what are some of the main contributors of CO2 for our county? And so our electricity usage, based on PALCO's published kilowatt-hour sales last year and the energy carbon intensity of electricity in the mix, if I recall, was somewhere around 15 kilotons, 15,000 tons of CO2 a year. Transportation in the sense of vehicles, assuming that our ownership patterns are similar to Washington State and our vehicle miles driven is similar to other rural areas in Washington State, is around a little bit more than 3 times that. And then a surprising one was the ferries, because this isn't something that shows up in normal kind of carbon calculators. But Ferries burn about 260 gallons of diesel an hour. You can make some assumptions about how many ferries we have. If you look at the web right now, we've got 4 running. Sometimes that's 5 or 6, depending on the season. But those are around 80 kilotons of carbon a year. So transportation is a really big one. And so this transition towards electrification of our transportation system seems really important. Another one that strikes me as kind of fascinating is these growlers that fly overhead, the E-18 growlers that fly out of Whidbey Naval Air Station, produce about 1,200 kilograms of carbon dioxide every hour, based on their fuel consumption. So it doesn't take many thousands of hours to equal what our entire vehicular traffic is in San Juan County. But thinking about what can be done here in San Juan County, besides transitioning to a lot of electric vehicles, I think the conversation around renewable energy and energy efficiency and emissions from the utility sector is a really interesting one. And one where there's a lot of fascinating change in technology. And I'm curious, Dan, for your thoughts on these kind of postcards that we're seeing from the future. Hawaii comes to mind, a state where retail electricity rates are really high. We're seeing very high penetrations of solar, on the order of 40%. And solar prices, as Dan has mentioned, have dropped 20-fold since 1978. They're headed downwards. How can we redesign our utilities so that we encourage energy efficiency and energy conservation, we encourage greater use of clean energy, and keep our utilities solvent? Foster's nodding. How do we do that? Because they've got fixed costs, and you know, my wife and I have had a lot of conversations with the PALCO about this, about rate structure. It's a really important question, but you know, do you have high fixed rates and then keep electricity prices low that can ensure that revenues come in, or are there other creative ways to continue to promote energy conservation and renewables without disincentivizing them through charging everybody a uniform high rate for just having a meter? So those are kind of my main questions. I'll pass it over to Eric.
Well, I guess I just want to bring it back as having Bill up here on the panel and thinking about kind of my personal trip of how I've come to get into the energy world and the consciousness that has developed personally, but it also goes back a generation that Bill was influential in inspiring with that Earthrise photo and the kind of eco movement that grew in the late 60s and early 70s. And I kind of grew up in the 70s as a kid, but sometime in the 90s I was leading wilderness expeditions in Mexico and found myself in a little cabin in Baja with a guy who had moved out of San Francisco in the early 70s and had a stack of whole earth catalogs on the shelf featuring that famous photo. And that's really when I started thinking about energy as far as systems, off-grid power systems, and renewable energy as something that I was fascinated with and interested in. And I've always thought that kind of growing up on an island and living on an island gives people a different understanding of energy in a certain way. I mean, islands in terms of ecological systems are used as models of isolated systems, and there's places that, you know, where the energy and material systems are isolated in island systems that can be very instrumental. I mean, I think our systems out here our social systems are really the most isolated and closed systems. Our energy flows in like it does, you know, under the submarine cables as if we were on the grid anywhere else. But there's something about that kind of holistic perspective that I think people on islands tend to understand, that it resonates with. And when I started doing solar power systems around here, it was the isolated off-grid systems that really got me passionate about it. And I think that holistic thinking is an important thing as far as looking at energy and understanding that it's the consumers that are drawing the energy, not so much that the system. I'm rambling here a little bit, but we're working on a new technology for off-grid systems, which Dan mentioned. I'll just talk about it briefly. We call it Capillary Grids. And it's a low-power distribution system for powering basic lighting and DC power devices using skinny wires to provide just the basic services. And when we talk about mini-grids or isolated systems, often what has become a problem in the past is consumer control. If you give everybody access to a central resource like a shared battery, everybody can't consume as much as they, if you give them that access, they'll find more ways to consume it. An example I use sometimes is a shared water tower in a town. If everybody was plumbed in with a 3-inch pipe to the shared water tower, they'll find ways to consume too much and suck the tank dry for everybody's detriment. But if you give them just a little straw, they can provide the basic needs that they have without over-consuming, and that's the idea of our skinny wire grid. As far as questions for Dan or feedback, I'm curious also. Chris had some great questions, but in particular, I think the electric vehicle penetration question is an interesting opportunity that we have here, and there's technology that I'm very interested in as far as vehicle-to-grid storage and using electric vehicle batteries as a source of stored energy to firm up the power supply from renewables in the grids. And I've always thought that we have a unique opportunity out here to be a model for high penetration of that type of technology. So I'm curious, Dan, if you have thoughts about that, and also what other types of emerging technology in the grid space in terms of storage and renewables and other things that perhaps we might have a unique perspective to develop or to be a model of for other communities as far as that goes, and storage being the one that seems to be emerging.
Thanks. I mean, these are neat. Let me try just to do a couple brief comments. I mean, I think that people's what you just heard was a really great set of examples of what we can do. And I'll just try to answer briefly, because then we get back to the audience Q&A too. So, I mean, Bill highlighted a couple things. One is that this kind of need to understand the shared systems. And Earthrise, I think, did more than any other example of telling us about the fragility of spaceship Earth and the need to pull these things together. And I mean, I think that has been one of the things that we lost in a very reductionist period of time in the 80s and 90s, when we were really excited about certain technologies, but not acknowledging the system aspect. And this will actually tie into questions that both Eric and Chris highlighted about the grid and needing to green the systems, but also to make utilities and others solvent. And so let me just comment on a couple things that ties this together. So I won't do a detailed picture, but one thing that we do in our lab is we build very detailed models of the grid system. And so right now, one of them is a grid of the whole West, called the WEC Interconnect. It's got Western Mexico, Canada, and all the Western states, including here. And so we look at scenarios that would get us from where we are today to this 2°C world. And so this is a whole set of pictures. The colors are sort of descriptive. Purple on the bottom is nuclear. We have coal, going up the blue is hydro, then there's gas, and then geothermal is red, yellow is solar, and blue is wind. And each of these pictures here are least cost way across the whole West to get from where we are now to 2050. And so that's a picture today. And again, there's cases where sunshot means cheap solar, low-cost battery is kind of the same thing, that low-cost version for batteries. My favorite scenario is going to come up where solar and batteries are cheap. Natural gas is expensive, there's leakage, a whole variety of scenarios, including ones where nuclear is deployable at scale, and also I put carbon capture as deployable at scale here as well. And the one that sticks out as like a sore thumb is if you don't keep being energy efficient, you need more power than the rest. But all of these are scenarios that we've run that are quite reasonable cost that get us to that 2-degree world. So 2020, 2030, you can see less efficiency is even worse. We're now seeing more geothermal and solar coming in. Here's a picture of 2050. Each of these scenarios are those green paths. So if what Bill highlighted about nuclear pans out, we can not only make them, these Generation 4 plants, make them safe, affordable, reliable. There's a very strongly nuclear-based case. Here are cases, again, the one I really favor is massive amounts of solar, some nuclear, some gas, lots of solar, and some wind. But what's really interesting about these cases is that each of these get there. That means this is not a technical choice. That means that what the technical energy engineer can tell you is, I can design you grid systems that get there in all these cases. And the only one of all these cases that's more expensive than our current path is where we're not energy efficient. Each of the others, I mean, there's assumptions about cost. The nuclear one assumes that the costs go down from today, whereas there's skeptics that think that won't happen. If we don't get low-cost batteries like we have for solar, but each of these are cases that are less cost than the business as usual, with 80% reduced or less carbon emissions. And I think this speaks to this kind of systems thinking you're highlighting. And we've been working on these systems. Oh, the picture came out terribly, but in Mexico, the WEC one for some reason didn't come out. In parts of Southeast Europe, in China, and India, and East Africa, and Chile, we have versions of these models. They all show the same thing. But I think the story that maybe ties this together is something we've been doing to try to provide people with a calculator tool so that individuals, businesses, schools, individual families, utilities can go in and do kind of carbon audit. And we run this package for all US states. A number of European governments have signed on. Philippines signed on recently. And you run through and you look at your audit and you say, you know, are you, what kind of electricity, how many miles do you drive, are you a vegan, are you vegetarian, or whatever else. You put all these things in. And the last page is this take action. And so what's plotted out here for someone who used our system just a couple months ago is for that individual, what the calculator spit out is that buying a more efficient car would save them $500 a year, $3,000 over 10 years. Telecommuting to work would also be a big savings. And the green checks are the things that this person, as part of a competition in their city, agreed to take on. And so I put the website here for those who want to try it out. What it shows you is the carbon across your zip code on a household average. And then you can compare yourself to that. So there's the website. We've been getting tons and tons of hits on it. And just to show you the maps. So here is carbon dioxide averaged over each zip code across the country, kilowatt hours consumed, natural gas consumption, and there's an interactive version. You go and you move your cursor, it shows you the breakout in terms of transportation, goods, services, etc. And if I were to recommend kind of one thing to describe what both Chris and Eric talked about, what would you do to get people kind of in this thinking, look at what the opportunities are, it would really be to do these detailed carbon audits and look at which of the transitions were good for individuals, which one made economic sense for farm cooperatives, for Alpalco, for others. And what we've been finding is that this dialogue is really the most interesting part of the process because it opens up alternatives. So while I was kind of bullish on the electric vehicles, what the story and what the numbers that Chris highlighted I think really bring to bear is that if we can't find ways to cross over between clean electricity, which we know how to do, although we're slowly ramping up, and clean vehicles, we don't get there anywhere near we don't get to these targets. And so programs that cross-fertilize are my favorite. So right now, the University of California system, about 430,000 students, staff, and faculty have a program where some faculty, some staff, and then a couple more senior kind of married student pairs can use the university as their bank. And what we're working on right now is a program where if you use the university as your bank in this mortgage assistance program, that if you turn in the title for an internal combustion engine car, then you'll be allowed to buy an electric vehicle and include that purchase price with your mortgage. And adding $20,000 to your mortgage when you're $500,000 or whatever else. I mean, it's significant, but it's really a drop in the bucket over 30 years. So there's an example of a cross-subsidy. Another cross-subsidy is this program here called PACE. And the idea of PACE is Property Assessed Clean Energy. The idea is that there are many municipalities that lend property owners money to do upgrades, to underground power lines, to fix sidewalks. Why not have a PACE program where you're lent money to do upfront energy efficiency and then clean energy options, and then you pay it back as an additional property tax? And the idea is, and it would stay with the home. So you sell the home, the next owner would take that over as part of the agreement. And it's a way to deal with the problem that efficiency in renewables may be wonderful, but paying for the power up front in a lump sum is just not working as a system, right? How many of us would have cell phones if we had to buy 20 years worth of minutes up front? I know my daughter would not have a cell phone if we had to buy 20 years of minutes for her up front. So PACE is another idea that utilities like Opalco and others on their own or working with the banks can do as a way to bring up the amount of generation, but also to have revenue available to invest in the upgrades and things they need to make all this happen. And so these are just a couple examples of ways to integrate and move across to really break down the barrier between your mobile energy and mobile carbon, your vehicle budget, and the stationary part, where there are much more and much quicker ways to bring down the bill. So just to finish up with Eric's last question, the place that I think I want to be most bullish and arguably are is what I highlighted. And that is, what I see right now is that the research in the world of storage is a good 2 decades behind where the solar world is. But that same learning curve we see for solar is now beginning to happen in storage. And to be honest, it really got started because of President Obama's stimulus package. That block of money that funded a whole new agency called ARPA-E, it's the Advanced Research Project Energy, modeled after DARPA, the Defense Advanced Project Agency, really put in money to a whole bunch of research programs at universities and think tanks on storage. And now we have everything from compressed air storage to unusual chemical systems to flow batteries like I showed you that don't degrade like regular batteries, to my current favorite proposed by a Korean researcher funded by the US agency, and that's a urea battery. So of course you can't beat the P battery as an opportunity to do very interesting, very low cost kind of organic systems. And I think it's that world where I would push out aggressively on vehicles. Every time a utility can jump into the vehicle space, on the clean side, they should be doing it, and these opportunities to marry all of this with storage, because while in California we have a problem that late summer our wind dies down for almost a week, some years to almost nothing. So we need storage, weak time stable. And here you have sort of 100 days or so where you might need that kind of storage. And so pumped hydro, opportunities for people who do build a new home to invest in things like the Tesla Powerwalls and other storage systems, biomass, if grown sustainably, are all opportunities to sort of build that picture back up. And so I've gone along. Chris has a question, and then we should just open it up.
Okay. Given that storage is a couple of decades behind solar's vast decreasing cost trajectory, and given that the low cost of renewables gives the opportunity for a lot more penetration of intermittent renewable energy generation, my understanding is that utility generation engineers really, their main job is to keep the lights on. And it's a tough job, especially if you've got to accommodate a fair amount of intermittent renewables. And I'm recalling it in the late 80s and 1990s when I was getting into renewable energy. I worked with a magazine called Home Power. Anybody ever Power magazine. And we were publishing out of this office that was 10 miles away from the grid down a four-wheel drive road on the Oregon-California border. And our power source then was solar and a small wind turbine. And we had a battery bank and a backup gasoline generator. But we were really loath to turn on the gasoline generator because it was noisy and expensive and smelly. And so we would often look up, check out what was going on. If the wind turbine was spinning a lot, or if it was really sunny, we would do a load of laundry. We would vacuum the house. And I'm bringing that up because in the bigger electricity system that we have, we don't have that feedback mechanism to be able to know that it's in this 100-day period when there's no wind, and the utility is needing to dispatch this really expensive combustion turbine gas, for example, to make up for that gap. And one of the scenarios that Dan was showing was this switching or load shifting scenario. And I'm really interested in the combination of that load shifting scenario plus a lot of solar plus some storage, because I think small signals to people, even if you just had kind of an iPad display thing on your refrigerator that was like, it's windy down on the Columbia Gorge, run that load of laundry, vacuum your house, that would make a big difference.
Right, so I totally agree. In fact, this whole area called demand-side management, we're just getting into. And the idea right now in many places, it's taking place in Georgia Power, VEPCO in Virginia is doing it, California utilities are doing it. And the idea is that we would have, I'm going to use this actually, so don't. So the idea is that we would send a signal, whether it's a price signal or an information signal. In the mini grid I showed in Tetiaroa, each room does in fact have an iPad, and it shows you all this because people who go there can sign up for the low carbon version of vacation or the regular one. Now, their big bugaboo is getting there. Airplanes are a big problem here, and so they've defined the system to be on-site, but they do exactly that. They send you signals about when it's good to use things or not. Utilities are only ramping up the experience in this, and most utilities I know don't even yet know what kind of a rebate should you give to someone yet, because some of that shifting can be voluntary and free, but others you of course want to pay for it, and a market moves you along. And so we are, I would say we are further behind in that than we are in getting storage ready. So it's a great question. I think it's also just a great point to open things up. So Bill?
Can I ask you a question in the alcohol guys? Why don't we just get meters that price the